right, are we, Natasha, are we good to start?
Yep, thanks, Martin.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to the webinar, Uberfication of Electricity, Unicorns and Rainbows, or a Real Thing Emerging? It's a pleasure to invite you to today's webinar. My name is Martin Weinstein. I hold different hats. I lead the Open Innovation Lab at Yale University. I lead the program on digital financing at the MIT Media Lab, and I run the Open Earth Foundation. But more than anything, I'm an alum of the Climate and Energy College, which is one of the hosts of today. And so this is a very specifically exciting event for me to reconnect from where I'm calling in from, United States, to also introduce an amazing speaker that has some exciting things to share. Also from an industry that I did also my PhD on, so I'll introduce her real quick in just a bit. But first, please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we're joining this webinar, and paying our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This webinar is being hosted by the Climate and Energy College at the University of Melbourne and the Energy Transition Hub, and is part of a series of 8 webinars on consumer-centric energy, sponsored by the Victorian Clean Technology Fund. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the Climate and Energy College's YouTube and Energy Transition Hub website by tomorrow. So if you know people that have missed today's session, you'll be able to share the session forward, as well if you'll have to review to catch up on some of the things that were discussed today. The latter part of the webinar will be run as a Q&A session. In fact, we'll do, Dr. Jemma Green will introduce in a second. We'll give her presentation, and then we'll try to broker an exciting discussion between everyone. So we'll be free to put your questions on the chat. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Jemma Green, who's the executive chairman and co-founder of Power Ledger, a blockchain-powered peer-to-peer energy and carbon credit trading platform. Jemma started her career banking in London before returning to Perth to do her PhD in electricity market disruption. She then helped to set up Australia's first fossil fuel superannuation fund in 2014, was elected Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Perth in 2017, and received the Ernst & Young FinTech Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 2018. And it's such a pleasure to introduce you, Jemma, into this talk. I did my PhD at the Climate and Energy College, focusing on disruptive business model innovations. And it was on the last year of my work that I bumped into the role that blockchain can have in empowering business models. And while I was thinking about the chapters that I was going to write on my thesis, it was Power Ledger that was creating some of the first global headlines on how this technology could be truly disruptive for the sector. So I'm excited to have you join us, and please kick it off. And hopefully I look forward to getting some exciting Q&A so that we can kick off exciting discussions.
Martin, it looks like we've lost Jemma. She's just coming back now.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Well, I don't know if you missed the introduction, Jemma, but I just made a fantastic introduction about you. So everyone knows already all your titles and the exciting thing that you've been doing. And the floor is almost ready to go for you to start.
Probably lucky I didn't have to hear it all. Thank you.
That's right. That's right. So honestly, feel free to kick off, and then we'll just start on a more dynamic discussion as soon as you want.
Perfect. Thank you, Martin. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional landowners from the southwest region of Western Australia, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders. And perhaps tradition is a good starting point for this talk, in particular, the tradition of black cabs in London. If you've ever considered becoming a black taxi cab driver in London, you would really have your work cut out for you. To become a black cab driver in London, you have to pass an oral and a written exam where you'd be tested on 320 routes and 25,000 streets, and you have to memorise them all by heart. And they also have to remember roughly 20,000 different landmarks and invest a princely sum of £55,000 to purchase a cab. It's actually like a famous exam, and it's so entrenched in the British culture that a West End play was written about the topic of the knowledge. And then one day Uber came along and said that people simply didn't need to memorise this stuff, and we're actually now in an era of satellite navigation and AI route planning, and Uber drivers don't even need to speak English because the software makes all the necessary communication just a matter of clicks and swipes away. But that didn't put the black cabs out of business overnight, or even actually in the space of a decade. And if you turn to my first slide, what's interesting is that Uber had to go to war with what seemed like large swathes of Europe for the right to play in European cities. And you can see on this slide here, there was a partial ban, which is reflected in the green colour, and red is a full ban. And this was in 2017. So it's quite significant. And I think none of this was a surprise to people like Clayton Christensen, who was a professor at Harvard Business School. He pioneered a theory which is called disruptive innovation. And he observed that innovation and disruption don't just happen like that. They're generally actually resisted by professional networks for as long as is possible. And Christensen said there are many disruptions that are in the wings, just waiting to happen. For example, universities are ripe for disruption, according to Christensen, but professional networks prevent this from happening, just as like pilot networks obstructed the emergence of budget airlines. But Uber, which had plenty of network resistance, had powered through, and perhaps in no small part because there is big money behind Uber. And big money has been needed for Uber to fight court cases and also to take on the collective might of professional cab drivers and the incumbent licensing system. So I guess the question is, what does that all tell us about the energy system? Assuming that we have a tried and tested distributed grid ready to go, there is still plenty of resistance to be overcome. And of course, we haven't got a tried and tested system yet. We're still working it out, and people like me at Power Ledger are finding a way through. So I think what we need to ask ourselves, what important questions are there to be addressed? For example, how do you solve the dispatchability deficit for electricity, and how do you solve the duck curve? But assuming we cracked it, what is the resistance going to look like? And the answer to that, in short, is strong. There's professional networks in place, check. There's large-scale infrastructure in place that needs repaying, check. There's established commercial ways to ensure revenue streams are maintained, whatever the new regulations, check. And there's a sense that something so existentially important cannot possibly be left to disruption, check. So I think the resistance levels are certainly significant, to say the very least. But I think it's important to spend a moment looking at the other side of the equation in terms of like what will actually be promoting or driving the change. And there's a few things to say on that. There's new regulation emerging in many different countries. So in the US, FERC 2222, which will allow distributed energy resources to aggregate and participate directly in wholesale markets. In the UK, Elexon P379, which will mean households can have multiple suppliers of electricity against 1 metre. In Europe, the Clean Energy Act, and in Australia, two-sided markets. And things like renewable energy certificates are doing very well around the world, being traded and generally reflecting an appetite for renewable energy. So that's another check. And Google are on the case, so check on that point too. And I think where Google tread, we know they're not going to do anything in like a half-hearted manner. And Google right now, and you could turn to the Google slide, are really trying to clean up the RECs, Renewable Energy Certificates Act. So they've started to try and send much more accurate market signals to the electricity system. And the idea is that RECs are increasingly being asked to marry up to the point of the creation of the REC, i.e. when and where the energy is generated, with the time and place of the consumption of that electricity. So in terms of time and space, Google is making sure that every kilowatt hour from place X and time T gets used at a place near to place X and time T. And they've actually started to publish quite intricate charts, which you can see here, of how they're doing this on this front. So you can see here 24-hour periodic usage clocks and spatial analysis. And this is a really class act, no doubt about it. They're actually moving their data centers and scheduling their big data processing events to line up with the peak solar output. And above all, Google putting money behind it in ways that one can't help feeling will drive through some of the resistance that I mentioned. So a big corporate backer creating a distributed grid, check on that point too. And I think what all that adds up to is that change is coming soon. But at the other end, the non-corporate end, there are things happening at a similar and more organic level, but from the bottom up. One of our clients in France, Equateur, is busy selling people exactly the sort of electricity they want: biogas, solar, wind, mixed to a certain percentage and proportions, delivered in a real and non-perplexing way, with no RECs involved whatsoever. And people are really loving what they're offering and getting involved. They've got more than 250,000 customers, and they're the 5th largest retailer in France. And then there's a company called the Hour of Power from a product called Hour of Power from Kiwi Electric in New Zealand. And this is also the fastest growing retailer there. And people nominate the hour they want free electricity on any and every day. And as a result, they get to really have a think about and save money on the electricity that they're using. And as a result of that, about 80% of their customers log in to their app every month, and on average 8 times a month. So it's creating a new level of engagement with consumers. And I think that all these new products are a sign that, right at the bottom, the consumer is also asserting their choice on the market and actually changing the shape of it as well. And I'm looking at all of this collectively and thinking, there's actually a kind of pincer movement. So you've got big Google from the top and Joe Public from the bottom, and we've got Power Ledger in the middle trying to create the infrastructure that can facilitate all of that. And we're looking to make partnerships with people who you might not think are natural bedfellows. So I think there you have it in a sort of nutshell. The forces of change and the forces of resistance, they're a bit like tectonic plates, pushing up against each other. And these things make for a very interesting dynamic. And it's one of the reasons, a technology company might have 40 times the valuation to turnover. And that multiple says that the market is pricing in ambitions and is willing to wait. And we can see this with tech companies in Australia like Atlassian, or other tech companies like Snapchat and Spotify, Amazon, and of course Uber, Uber was created in 2009, over a decade ago, and it's not yet in profitability. The forecast is for that to happen sometime later this year. And, I think we should ask ourselves, do we ever imagine people will still be driving licensed cabs earning their routes off by heart in another decade or so? I think it's safe to say the answer is probably no. And for the distributed grid, will we be having predominantly centralised fossil fuel-based electricity in another 10 years? I don't think so either. So I think these are still early, but very exciting times. And I look forward to the conversation now and hearing from those who share this sense of inevitability, however the time frame ends up being, and who are up for bringing this reality forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemma. I think this was a great tone setting for the conversation now, and you've started with an introduction of how we can see disruptive innovations and describing where the space is for opportunities to happen. And it's true that we haven't seen the Ubers in the electricity space yet, and it's fair to say that we agree that that's bound to happen because of the different things that you pointed out, and how regulation needs to change, and how regulation leads to new business model opportunities, but also the inevitability of a full decarbonization and the opportunities to improve that. I don't know if all of our attendees have a good grasp on what you and Power Ledger do, but I think it would be at least good to give a couple of introductory remarks of how you've bumped into this space, because you're clearly interested in can really catalytic disruption happen here. And you've talked about Rex a little bit. You talked about DER, or distributed energy resource aggregation, all different pieces, and set up a couple of business models. But I think if you're able to give a summary of what you've set out with Power Ledger, and not only what you've set out to do, how that has changed since you started, because one of the key aspects of a good enterprise that has to discover a new field that's constantly changing is how do you adapt and pivot, and where are the opportunities. You even talked about regulatory arbitrage. You may have a business model that works very well in one place or not somewhere else, or you think that this business model is perfect, but it just doesn't work where you want to operate, so you have to go somewhere else. So perhaps before going into Q&A, you could give a bit of context, and what do you think then, and what do you see now has been from a technology standpoint, which is a bit of the argument that you're making, is a secret sauce, or not so secret sauce, but really that changed the game, and that's hopefully that's been part of your research with Power Ledger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Power Ledger platform, it's software, and it really was designed to do a combination of three things: to facilitate the trading of electricity, to facilitate the trading of environmental commodities, and ownership of energy assets, all utilizing blockchain. And I think blockchain can be a little bit overstated in terms of the need to understand the complexity of it, or actually functionally what it provides. But I think it's a bit, I like to sort of draw a comparison between barcodes in a supermarket. Barcodes don't make the supermarket. You can obviously have a supermarket without barcodes, but it actually makes it function in a particular way that's very efficient and is scalable. And so that's why we use the blockchain. There are lots of things that can be done equally without one, but using a blockchain unlocks potential for more complex transactions, and to provide a scaled market in a more cost-efficient fashion. So in terms of the trading of electricity, peer-to-peer trading is something that we're very well known for, and was the first product or platform feature rather, that we launched into the market. And we've been doing product market fit trials around that to see what the appetite is, what's the technical integration process, and where is it likely to be delivering scale firstly and foremost. And that's been a really interesting journey. And I think peer-to-peer trading probably en masse will happen first at scale in Europe as a result of the clean energy package, which requires all the EU member states to adopt energy sharing regulation in local law by the end of 2021. And the first place that is doing that, I think in Austria this month, they're pushing through the local laws to do that. And the response from their side is actually to reduce the network costs by 40%. which is an interesting strategy, but not the only way that it can be done. I think subsidised feed-in tariffs have really obscured the price of peer-to-peer trading, and you can, if you don't have subsidised feed-in tariffs, with the existing network tariff pricing can make peer-to-peer very attractive, particularly if you couple the ability to monetize grid services, network services, ancillary services and things like that from solar and batteries. But also loyalty peer-to-peer trading is something that can actually work at scale in most markets. So that's where large businesses want to procure renewable energy from their customers from surplus solar and pay them in product or product vouchers. And because of the margin that exists on products, they're able to offer an uplift on the solar electricity. And it means that their customers are more likely to consume their product. And for that, we've got several projects we're working on, one with a beer manufacturer that wants to be 100% renewable. And yeah, I think large retailers that have their own buildings that are not in shopping centres, that's really sort of a sweet spot for them. And then more broadly around virtual power plants, which is, you know, inside of energy trading, that is something that has enormous growth potential right now in Australia, because particularly on the national electricity market, where there's very high spot prices for electricity in the wholesale market, and the frequency control and ancillary service market also offers significant economic opportunity too. So as an example, in South Australia, the spot arbitrage could deliver, you know, $200 to $300 a year from a 10 kilowatt hour battery, and the FCAS market, based on the past 12 months, could deliver anywhere up to $1,000. So that's a lot of income earning potential for a household battery to play in a virtual power plant. And I think more over time, the inclusion of electric vehicles will also change the load profile of the grid and offer more economic opportunities for virtual power plants. So that sits inside of our energy trading portfolio of platform features, and flexibilities markets as well. So networks need to either like curtail surplus solar in the grid or curtail wind if it's causing, you know, issues like the duck curve, but instead they're now like offering payments for grid services, and that I think can provide more income streams as well as the spot and FCAS markets for batteries. And using blockchain and particularly smart contracting functionality, you can co-optimize for the best economic use case for the battery and deal with multiple transactions between different counterparties in a very transparent way. So that's something that I think is very exciting and really will move the conversation around renewables causing problems in the grid to actually being part of the solution. So more broadly, I think we see our platform as bridging the gaps in the system to help make it more fluid and responsive. And so that's on energy trading. And then environmental commodities trading is renewable energy certificate trading. So tokenizing certificates and making them exchange traded, also matching REC purchasing against the load profile using the blockchain to be able to do that in a very, so you can be like Google, but without Google's analytics behind you, and where trade and settlement are one and the same thing on the blockchain to create more efficient markets. So I think, yeah, that is it kind of in a nutshell. We're about 4 years old and we've got about 20 projects in 10 countries.
Wow. Okay, so you've really also expanded in different regions. And I think I understood well how you articulated that the core technology makes sense when you really are operating at scale. If you're doing trading among small amounts of actors, it would be a bit of an overkill, but it's designed to allow that level of complexity at scale, right? And so that applies to different parts. Well, we have some very exciting Q&As, very sophisticated questions. I'm not surprised based on the crowd that we have. And I understand that I'm able to allow people to talk. So I'm going to first invite Alice Endersby to talk and express. Alice,
hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. So I lived in New Zealand and I was a consumer of the Hour of Power program, and I suppose my my position was that it among my peers, it definitely increased our net consumption, given that that was a possibility. And as the program exists now, a lot of that net consumption was from fossil fuel derived energy. And I'm just wondering, like, in these kind of programs, to what extent does it encourage or sort of give this false sense of security for the consumer that they're not paying for something, and that therefore the cost to them versus the value is kind of separated in a way that it's not when you're paying the whole time? And I'm just wondering how you think this influences consumer behaviour and net consumption of any goods, whether that's energy or product, and how you view that as a potential risk moving forward in consumer behaviour. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your question, Alice. I think there's probably two things to say on that. I think what the hour of power demonstrates for me is that that consumers are willing to and want to be engaged when the engagement is compelling. So for me, it almost dispels the myth that consumers are not interested in electricity. Kiwi Electric have dished up renewables, or even just a regular tariff, in a way that has created a high level of engagement, and most of their customers know how much energy they're using and how much energy they're using at different times of the day. So that way of engaging and gamifying electricity, I think, could be used for any purpose, and in terms of like encouraging the use of a better use of the grid or more use of renewables. On your second point, regarding that they're using more power which is derived from fossil fuels, well, I think that is very interesting and feeds into the conversation around renewable energy certificates. 2 weeks ago, on the I think it was like a full page in the Telegraph in the UK, was a piece saying how the energy companies are claiming their fossil fuel energy is green by buying renewable energy certificates for like 30p or 80p. It reminded me a little bit of what happened with Nike in the 90s, where, it was, purchasing shoes or getting them manufactured in developing countries and not really caring about what, the impacts on child labour and things like that. And they were fine with it, but the public wasn't. And it resulted in boycotts and ultimately them changing their practices, and the practices around manufacturing of clothes abroad really changing quite significantly. And I think with renewables, we've been talking about them for so long. Everyone thinks that the energy should just be green, and I'm being sold a green tariff, and therefore it must be green. And I think that that consumers are probably tiring from it being so opaque and not really knowing what they're actually getting. And so I think that the dissatisfaction with the lie, or dissatisfaction with it not being fully authentic, is going to drive the demand for more renewables. And our client in France, which I mentioned briefly, Equateur, they're using our platform to help their customers choose their own energy mix. So they're actually able to specify, I want 15% solar from this farm, 15% wind from that farm, and we're actually equating the output of that asset against their consumption in an interval. And I think that getting more granular and specific in energy tariffs is something that I would expect there to be more demand for over time, as people become tired of what they've been offered up until now.
Great, thank you. There's also a very, very interesting question from Siegfried on, and I'm going to maybe have Siegfried describe it. The question is, DR microgrids depend on IEEE standards 1547 real-time transactional IoT-based VPP systems, virtual power plants. The question is, how do you resolve the open network integration requirements when storage systems are built around closed proprietary software? And I think the question is, how do we enable interoperability if a lot of the software is a black box? But feel free to give more context.
Yeah, it's a great question. We've just partnered with Sonnen, which are a German battery manufacturer that are owned by Shell. And we did that because the API connection is very good, and we were able to connect to their inverters and control the batteries. So that interoperability is much more seamless. And I think that is going to differentiate, types of batteries that people can buy, and the ones that are able to participate in VPPs have more income earning opportunities and therefore are going to be more appealing to the market. So I almost think that is the next generation will need to do that as a default and be interoperable.
You're quite correct, Jemma. I'm actually building a DER system in the city of Melbourne right now, and a VPP, I should say, as an energy cooperative, a community energy cooperative. And one of the things I'm facing is, of course, that Sonnen and the battery system that they're using won't allow me to, access their batteries because they're Tesla that they're using. I think there are a couple of other battery manufacturers, I think Redback and others that I've contacted, because you can't rely on what battery systems people buy, also won't allow me to access their proprietary software through our integrated software approach. There is one battery manufacturer living in Moorabbin that will. So really what I'm facing is that I have to make individual negotiations with battery manufacturers in order to build my VPP. That is just complete nonsense, and from my point of view. And the business model would then have to simply specify, look, we're going to use a Synergy battery. It's better than a Tesla because it delivers double the lifetime, and it allows us to deliver open system integration. That.
Ooh, sorry, I think. Yeah, the points that you bring in are super relevant for across the energy space and across around delivering trust between proprietary softwares, but also interoperability. And a big part of what the work that we do at the Open Innovation Lab is exactly how do we establish common digital languages, common protocols, common standards. And this goes back to what you were saying, Jemma, on we have to have a clear grasp of what we're buying. And so it's a bit of rebuilding trust, whether we know where the electrons are coming from, but also if we're building a business model that we can interoperate with business models, even if they're kind of closed source. And I think fortunately, we'll probably see in the next couple of years how a lot of the work on cryptography underlying a lot of the blockchain space is enabled to deliver trust on some form of calculation behind a firewall, let's say, or behind a black box, to ensure that it could be audited without the end user having access to the raw data or to the raw source file. So I do think that it's part of our research on new open systems and new technologies to enable open systems that might be able to really deliver an open and interoperable energy internet in some sense. Wondering if you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. You make that all these different platforms, hardwares need to have like application and programming interfaces that can talk to each other and do so in an efficient way to facilitate the markets that will underpin them. So I think there's a lot of proprietary software that isn't really contemplating anything other than itself. And I think that ultimately that there will need to be integration.
Right, for some of these business models to really operate at scale. I'm going to allow John Cripps-Clark to talk and ask his question, which I think really speaks a bit to the thesis that you brought at the beginning on creative disruption. And I think you raised this Schumpeter's creative destruction, even though you were talking about Christensen. John, please go ahead and pose your thoughts on
Thanks very much. It actually refers to what you've just been talking about, which is kind of the robustness of the system. And by moving to a much more market and individualist, small companies competing in the way that you're suggesting, what resilience do we need to build into the system? Because we really can't afford to have catastrophic failures in the way we could afford to have catastrophic failures in other markets.
Well, I think that that's why we need a hybrid system. I think even with a lot of sun and wind, the cost of actually putting enough battery storage in to provide electricity needs for several consecutive days in the winter when you might not have a lot of sun necessitates alternative forms of energy that can provide that intermittent requirement. So hydropower, gas-fired power stations. And so you can see that like forecast in the integrated system plan for the NEM that around 2035, like gas doesn't have a huge role to play for the next decade, but around 2035, there'll be a need for that in the system to provide the stability.
And do you mean physical resilience, or also, I mean, I think you make a point here about taxis that you could fail in your taxi innovation and the world can still go on, whereas if you fail in your innovation in energy, that has more catastrophic, which is true, but then also it's an argument to not allow innovation to happen.
I think that definitely. Martin, I just realized that I have to leave this room, so I have to jump off the call, the webinar now. So I'm so sorry. But I think that can definitely, just to summarize, I think that could definitely be used as an excuse. But I think the forces at play are ultimately going to change the dynamics here, and the resistance, I think the disruption is inevitable, but the destruction of value is more optional.
So this is goodbye, Jemma. We have to thank you and give you a digital applause.
Thank you
for attending today. If we have more questions coming your end, I'm happy to stay until 45.
Thank you.
Whoever wants to geek around. There goes Jemma, and I think the only comment that was left is that, as Siegfried was describing the Appleification of DERs, I'm wondering if that refers to the concept of the Apple Store or the App Store, where different apps have to share a common operating system. If so, I would also agree. If people have more questions or want to keep the discussion, I'm here, happy to broker any good discussion that needs to happen. Otherwise, we can also close and then finish early. Any more questions? I think we can wrap up. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure being part of the college experience as again after so long, and love to see the familiar names. We'll coordinate with Natasha on when the recording's available online, so that hopefully should be in the next couple of days for you to review. With that, blessings and have a great day there in Australia. Look forward to more webinars that hopefully are able to engage me as well. Thank you everyone for joining and for the great questions.